Gentry Grace. Nobody, not even the rain, has such small hands. Longing, my father. That's why, that's what I have been and where. Always this longing. And your war and violent world in 10,000 philosophical words of flaming things cannot contain me now. I grew up through you, and now, out your mind and from your heart I would spring. I would fly from you and all this pain your philosophy hath wrought, in 4,000 men and your only daughter. Pain and angry hurt. So much pain still growing from the cornrows of Antietam, where your philosophy made fertilizer of friends. So much hot, wet anguish still flowing from Federal and Confederate eyes alike, all straining to see through the musket smoke of a shot-up Shiloh there. Where did my son fall? Where exactly did my daddy die? These are places now in me, Father, where young men and boys took their wounds and fell, never to rise again as anything remotely what they were when they were pure and perfect, bouncing around in unburned homes which needed them, all of them, to live long lives beneath nature's more perpetual sway. And now, these two living soul dyers sitting before me hurt me in my woman's soul, like watching little ignorant children starve to death with their smiling, laughing faces, unknowing of their own lethal fragrance, hanging about them like dying, pungent peonies in my bedroom window. I see them, these two soldiers here, my father, but they do not see me. I am invisible, but your watery and fading and also green eyes will always see through me, and I through them. But green of my own now, as I must, as I can. It seems we all will see through each other here this evening. But I must pause in reading aloud what you have written to these soldiers here, written for me to read as some strange malady hath changed your deep sonorous voice into mine. So I pause, even as Mark Antony must pause, who, grieving over another Caesar slain, claims his heart to be in the coffin there with his murdered favorite emperor. So I must pause as my heart is in the coffin of my girlhood you so deliberately threw in with brigades of boys, playing war beside my French dolls you brought me from Paris. Did you know, my general father, that your little girl is gone even as she sits beside you? Oh, I am all green again in the fields of my interior longing. Forever green the world I would know, a world without your precious war. And if you will not see me, see who I am now, then I would to a world without you much in it. Oh, my father, this longing, like your war, I can hardly bear it. And so this longing bears me. The general was a patient man, as long as he did not have to wait. The general was a gentle man, as long as he went unruffled. He waited without worry for Gentry Grace to continue reading his words aloud. She was a willful woman now, like her mother who had passed when Gentry Grace was just 15. And no woman, not even the general's beloved if long-buried wife, had ever understood his military mind, his cold intent, his righteous heart the way this brilliant and beautiful daughter-girl of a woman did. Gentry Grace will begin again when she is ready. Do not press her. You will be sorry, as sorry to receive her ire as enfilading fire down your lines. There is so much within her a military man will never understand. General P.J.D. Wayne will be patient with her in their living room today. General Wayne will be kind. For waiting on Gentry Grace was what the general did within the war rooms of his own somewhat blood-blockaded brain now. He waited for her even as she waited on him in most things. The malady had taken the glory of his speech, but none of the fire of what he had always spoken. Being patient with Gentry Grace was easier for the general now that he had no choice but to wait for her, to begin again those words he started in her. He did not know such words had become a terrible sentence to her. Where did she go when she paused in reading his words? What did she see when he and the room the four of them sat in now just disappeared? The general did not know. Perhaps she was arranging her flowers in her little home out back again. Gentry Grace, for a year now, had spoken her brigadier general father's warring words with her own peace-loving tongue, had loaded his harsh sentences, fragmented and sharded, into her own gentle, inviting and receptive mouth with her own delicate, ungloved fingers, had loaded and reloaded without question another's murderous philosophy. Only now, all the flaming things issuing from his pen through her mouth had made her once long smile seem sour and short in the glass to her, as though her breath was of gunpowder and burned coffee, like these men before her now in this living room, dedicated to death. Her mouth was the muzzle of rifled cannon now. Her lips were lines on maps that moved on rivers and railways those frightened men and their rotting rations. Nevertheless, these words she read now were too obviously not her own anymore, and she could not make them into her own anymore, not anymore forever. And so Gentry Grace had to pause in her reading of her father's words. It felt now as if her tongue were about to join a more interior rebellion forming up inside her own petite frame. Ranks of 10,000 Gentry Graces, beautiful and free in their girlhood, hair all wild in the unacrid wind, lined the hills of her young woman's heart. But there were no gleaming infields in this private morning sun to shine fear in the eyes of a brothered enemy. There was no malice in Gentry Grace. Hers was not to rebel for hatred of authority, either for hatred's sake, nor for authority's unrelenting nature. Gentry Grace's rebellion had nothing to do with hatred, nor any outward authority. Gentry Grace's rebellion had to do with longing, her own. Gentry Grace wanted to tear this letter of her father's orders to these two soldiers now into little pieces. She thought about it. She wanted to throw the hateful thing into the air like confetti, let all the little white words of hatred for the enemy fall like ripped-up paper snowflakes onto the floor around the two soldiers' heavily booted feet. Let such snow light upon her father's feet too, his socked, swollen, and marched-out feet. And to know that this same four-footed beast of two melded men resting firmly on her floor now had also stood shoulder to shoulder at Shiloh. How the warmth in her soul would melt such paper now. If only she could speak with her own mind. Gentry Grace's hands gripped the letter like a knife's edge. Paper cannot cut too deeply, but can sting and slice softly a woman's soul into shreds. Every word held powder like cartridge paper dropped at the hornet's nest, emptied into the hearts of inflamed men. Where are such hearts now? 7,000 souls and counting in Corinth, falling from bloody bodies shuttled from Shiloh, and now more in the papers falling like snowy cartridge paper piled in drifts around captured federal feet. Where are they now? Where are those beautiful boys who marched by her window, boys whom she loved with a pure heart and an iron will to set the slave free? Oh, what has she done? Will warm and warring words keep the living warm when winter comes without crops? There can be no crops after such slaughter, because the dead do not tend crops. The dead only serve to make sadder soil. It was the next morning. Gentry Grace never did begin again to read aloud the last night's letter. She just left the room, left the house, and went into her own house just behind the general's. But she had returned at dawn to fix breakfast for the men, only it looked as if she were dressed for a military ball. Gentry Grace fried bacon and ground coffee in a silk Parisian dress that stunned Corporal John Dane. His captain, the second soldier, had his eyes buried in a book. Last night, Gentry Grace wanted to have them both whipped, and her father too. Why? For being so dismissive of why they were brought before the general in the first place. The big soldier was here on charges of conduct unbecoming an officer. The captain seemed here to cover for his corporal. It was maddening for Gentry Grace. The comparatively tiny dining room chair creaked under Dane's horse-like weight. He froze with an ascending leg waiting to be crossed. Then slowly, gently, the corporal put his huge foot back down, same as if he had heard a noise while tracking the enemy. What Dane didn't need to do right now was to break the general's fancy chair. Dane was already under fire for conduct unbecoming. Only, Dane wasn't as worried about the general as the general's daughter. Gentry Grace didn't seem in the mood to watch her mother's fine French furniture get destroyed, any more than she seemed ready to hear another word about what didn't go on in the field. In truth, Gentry Grace seemed in a mood Corporal John Dane could not now comprehend. Her petite and shapely frame, all tightly bound in her French silk dress, copper and green colored, her white shoulders exposed without the need for adornment of jewelry. Her slender neck was a counterpoint for the hammer in her head she seemed to carry for him. It was clear her intention, as Gentry Grace had paused in the doorway of her kitchen at breakfast and had said directly to Corporal Dane, "I read all reports to my father, sir. I know what you did to that drummer boy. I also know I'm not your judge, Corporal Dane. Captain Kent's report clearly states that you do not require a whipping with a bullwhip, as the captain himself, quote, thrashed you fairly in the field." While Gentry Grace did not roll her green eyes to the top of her pretty, proportionate head, when she disclosed this, she may as well have. For she looked at John Dane, who seemed to take up the whole south end of the room just sitting at her dining room table, and then she looked at Captain Kent, who seemed to occupy no space at all, as he stood beside Dane, his back to the giant, perusing the general's modest library. Dane looked almost as tall and more ferocious sitting down with a lace dinner napkin tucked into his own shirt than Captain Kent would look in a suit of armor. The contrast would have been comical in Gentry's eyes if it hadn't been so insulting, and Dane knew it, knew himself for an unpunished, murderous thing who had been cruel to a child in the name of a lesson learned. Gentry Grace continued as she set a plate of bacon down gently in front of the corporal. "While Captain Christopher and Captain Kent both agree that your skill with the rifle saved a federal officer's life, I must remind myself that such skill also killed a rebel son." Gentry had the corporal's full attention now. She knew what she was doing. Gentry Grace had her own plan of attack, dressing like that for breakfast. The corporal's own captain had turned his back on him and left him to fend for himself with this very dangerous daughter standing at Dane's right hand. The mention of the rebel son had instantly enraged Dane, and Gentry Grace saw that rage pooling in his watery cornflower blue eyes. Dane's eyes glistened almost level into her own water-shimmering greens. Gentry Grace had leaned into Dane's look before she meant to. Compelled by the look, she was drawn into battle before she was ready. Her peaceful plan fell apart at first real eye contact. It was then that Gentry Grace had suddenly slapped Corporal Dane hard across his large left gaunt cheekbone. "Don't you ever look at me that way, soldier. Like you could kill me? You forget yourself, sir. Why, you are almost literally 2 of me. I am 4,000 of you, and I am the general's voice in this matter. You raise your look to me again in this matter for which you have been called here, and I will have you whipped, sir, by a certain staff sergeant I know nigh as my uncle. You will receive your reward for insubordination at least. There will be no fair thrashing here. Here your thrashing will hurt. I am not here to prove my position to you, nor to belittle your manhood by making claims. Neither am I here to be intimidated by you. I have fixed bacon and coffee for killers like yourself since I was old enough to fry bacon and to grind coffee. It's not the killing, but the hatred, your bitter hatred, which appalls me. Killing the enemy is awful, but such a deed as cruelty to a child must have its judgment day. Only I'm not your judge. And then Gentry Grace went still in the midst of her sentence. Her hand hurt her where she had slapped Dane, but it wasn't her pain that stopped her speech. It was his. The man needed discipline. The man needed to know that the fear he put into that boy was a terrible deed. It was wrong. But what the man didn't need from Gentry Grace was more violence. Truly, violence was all John Dane had known of life for longer than he cared to remember. And while Gentry abhorred violence, she found herself suddenly slipping into it like the dementia her father so feared for himself. She saw, maybe for the first time, herself, a new killer up close, a beautiful killer who wore pretty things and could play the pianoforte. Gentry had felt her stomach lurch then. The smell of bacon had made her want to throw up. What she saw in those amazingly blue soldier eyes was a reflection of her own green rage and frustration. None of this was supposed to happen, this being, of course, the loss of a man's soul to a cause she thought she loved, the cause of abolition. Gentry Grace had been raised by a Marshal Strategist. She had learned how to judge men like horses for the way they handled themselves while tethered to others or to a cause. And for the thousands of soldiers paraded by the dolls of her girlhood and on into this gentle grace of her young womanhood now, Gentry Grace had never seen Dane's equal in stature, nor in warlike intent, and, she had to secretly confess, nor in sheer beauty of carriage. But the cost of making such a soldier was so high. And what was the real return on such an investment? Pain and sudden death. Gentry Grace had felt somehow, though she could not say how, Corporal Dane's anguish when she had slapped him. Was there some kind of exchange between her hand and his cheekbone? A secret shake that made them kin in this whatever it was that was happening here? Gentry couldn't say. What was clear was the need of a new strategy with this man. Dane had dropped his gaze onto the plate of bacon. He had been in this situation before. The last woman who had slapped him was his own wife, and Dane had allowed that slap too. He understood. When a woman's child dies like a dog on the dirty street, it can make her want to slap the man she blamed. So he had let her slap him and kick at him and claw at him and pull a handful of his hair out in both their anguish and grief. Miss Gentry's slap was a vague reminder of something he could not forget anyway. But this little woman now hit him harder than he had ever been hit before, more so even than his lost wife. But he understood. Dane didn't have a poker face. If he felt like killing you, he was given to communicating such a feeling in his expression. But the expression was more often for deterrence than intention. More than once in his life, Dane had cleared a room with just an angry look. He didn't mean to look so hateful at Miss Gentry. That's not what he meant at all. He just hated the enemy, or even the mention of the enemy. What Gentry Grace saw in him had to frighten her. He knew it, and he was ashamed. It was clear she was not built for the kind of battle he knew, but that didn't keep her from ruling the field between them now. Gentry Grace was, well, the most beautiful and delicate woman John Dane had ever seen up close. She had her golden hair all piled up on top of her head, but there was this one lock that would not obey her bone-colored hair combs. It was a rebellious, beautiful golden rivulet of unruly wildness lying close to her cultured, if pearlless neck, just over her refined right and righteous ear. When Miss Gentry had mentioned the rebel's son, Dane had flashed on that moment the boy had died. That rebel only wanted to see the tree line again one more time before the darkness of his death. And Dane had overlaid that boy soldier's dying desire with his own, that is, to smell Gentry Grace's hair up close just once, to let that one rebellious lock touch his federal face just once, before he himself died. But his look got all confused and caught up with other things. Too many things going on at once now in John. He felt she despised him for his violence, and he felt he could love her just for existing in such a time as this. An hour passed in silence after the slapping. Gentry Grace had retreated some steps to the other end of the table. She had collapsed onto her own chair without a single creak. How light her brigade of charms, even as his cheek was warm from the fire of her first touch. All John Dane could see was the hand he hurt with his face. He knew her hand was hurting. He watched her rub her small but long fingers against her soft palm. Maybe she would not play so pretty for a while, her pianoforte in the next room. Maybe his large, hardened face had broken a small bone in her small hand. What had he done? He was not afraid that she would have him transferred to some starving front to die in combat for what he had done, or whipped again and again. John was afraid he had caused Miss Gentry pain with just a look. He dared not speak. He knew how to wait in silence for the enemy to move, to give away a position that he otherwise would not have found. Only an hour in a loud chair gives away a man's position like nothing else in the wild. Gentry Grace had stared, Corporal Ding had to assume, death at him. Only it didn't feel like death, nor even cold. Dane didn't know what he felt, but something was reforming inside the girl, it seemed. She had been thrown back by her own force. Gentry Grace's assault seemed upon herself now. Dane knew he was here on her order, not the general's. The general didn't care about some drummer boy. But for some reason, Dane's action had so incensed the general's daughter that she would have her say with Dane. It was a dangerous war, whether in a living room littered with war maps 100 miles north of the Mason-Dixon line, or in a gorgeous valley loud with cannon fire 500 miles to the south. The Sharps rifle Dane carried, modified with a longer barrel and equipped with advanced optics, had been a gift from the abolitionist movement. 100 or so such rifles had been shipped to Kansas. The stocks even had a coffee grinder built in. Before that rifle, John Dane had been a two-gun plainsman, more skilled up close with a Bowie knife than he cared to admit. Then that awful day in Lawrence came. And the flames of hatred that had flickered in him were fanned bright and consuming until his whole earth lay scorched and black beneath his brown boots. When that wagon rolled in later with rifles, Dane had pushed his way to the front of the crowd and took what the abolitionists had offered. After he had buried his only son and father and lost his wife to the prairie madness, John Dane learned to look at life through a scope. Dane had learned to squeeze and not to pull, had learned to wait for that moment when his own heart paused between beats. It was in that stillness, in that silence and out-breath, that Sharp's thunder roared and men fell. After the hour of reconnoitering John Dane from her end of the dining room table, going over the reports in her head and now comparing them to this man before her, Gentry Grace was in some disarray. She had been prepared to see a demon, ugly and pitted, to match such merciless deeds enacted with rifle fire upon man and beast alike. Only the corporal was far from ugly, and his charisma was palpable like warm, heavy rain that soaks the clothes through the skin. Gentry had only managed to repulse herself in her assault on him with her sudden and soundless slap. Only Dane did not want this enemy repulsed. Dane wanted this enemy girl to try again, somehow, just try something again. Maybe if he gave her his rifle, taught her to shoot, to use an open sight instead of her narrow scope, then she might see that he is not the horrible demon she's aiming to find. But then, that was a lie. He was a bad man, he knew it. His only hope was that Gentry Grace might be merciful to him, a killer of men and their horses, and sometimes their dogs too. And also sometimes Dane was just crazy with grief and hatred and pain, and was guilty of giving it all to a drummer boy, most likely dead now, or rotting in Andersonville. Gentry Grace had changed her tactics then. Over a plate of bacon nobody had the appetite to eat anymore. Gentry Grace regrouped, and then naturally adopted the nature of her own name. In one stroke she went from fury to a gentle graciousness that almost overwhelmed her as she got up from her chair. After the slap and rebuke, there had been silence in the dining room. The general had not yet arrived for breakfast. The captain, knowing John as no other officer could know him, knowing Corporal Ding for a stone-cold killer, still, Captain Kent also knew that Miss Gentry could beat the big man into unconsciousness, and John still would not lift a finger to the woman. Perhaps not because Miss Gentry was a woman, or even that she had the power in her pen to have him whipped half to death, but that Gentry Grace was also righteous in her rage. John Dane was guilty of cruelty to children, to men, and to animals. And it was Corporal John Dane's own understanding of this awful fact that stayed his mighty hands flat upon her wooden dining room table, like a sorry, scolded child. Captain Kent had quietly left the dining room then. Gentry Grace did not need a captain's protection from the corporal. Rather, it was the corporal who had needed something like shelter from what was coming. Gentry Grace began again after an hour of silence, her voice gentle, gracious now, like a loving mother or lover. Last evening, I tried to read the lies my father chooses to believe. I wanted to tear the letter to you and your captain into shreds. But I didn't, Corporal Dane. I just stopped reading. I stopped and left the three of you to smoke your tobacco and to whisper war in my dead mother's living room. I went out of this house into my own house out back that once served as servants' quarters for the slaves of our forefathers. I have had the house completely refashioned. When I enter in there, I am home. This is not my home, Corporal. This house is little more than a war tent for my father now. That chair in which you sit, that strains under your weight, was never made for a man of your, let us say, large caliber. You're uncomfortable here. Yes, I know. I am too. And then Gentry Grace began her second, if ever so slow, advance upon the fixed position of one Corporal John Dane. Gentry moved closer to his side, as one moving silent into a fire hole, careful not to alert the enemy, careful not to alarm a friend. John had felt his heart suddenly start, or maybe it stopped, he didn't know. Something was happening. This beautiful enemy was bearing down on his right flank hard, and so softly too. And he was collapsing inside. So close Miss Gentry was moving, so close and quiet. Now she stood beside him. She still only a head taller than he, even as he sat looking forward, as a soldier under inspection. Gentry Grace's copper-colored silk dress had a green sheen in his periphery, made her green eyes blaze in his brain. There was green, too, under the copper-colored lace that bordered her bare, white shoulders. Just looking at the general's daughter was a dangerous prospect. A man could look too long, get caught looking, and wind up with a whipping. But this close proximity was a whole new hazard. John was being overrun by her. The way she smelled of peppermint. Any closer and he would have to retreat to a place he had never been before. He didn't know where, but if she kept up such pressure, his line would surely break and he would have to run. And just as he felt the new nearness and was sure he could not sit for it, Gentry Grace reached out and touched his face where she had just slapped him. There was a small red patch under his left eye. Why, Corporal Ding, I do believe I see Old Glory waving in you. Here, the red where I slapped you upon your white face, and that endless blue of your eyes. It was a trap. John was certain of it. With the captain gone, Miss Gentry could claim anything. Maybe she didn't want his whipping. Maybe she wanted his head like bacon on a platter. Closer still, Gentry Grace pressed Dane. Any closer, and it would be hand to hand, or, in this case, her body against his. He dared not look at her. Please, do not think me improper. May I call you John? Gentry Grace asked, almost whispering. John was silent. If he could just look full at her, just take her in without open sights. Just look at her as no enemy, rather, just some lovely dream he was having. But to look to his right and slightly upward now would put him dead in her green sights. For the first time in the entire war, John Dane was truly afraid to move. I know what you need, John, and it's not whipping. It's not even leave, though I suspect you need leave of all the horror you have seen, and you yourself hath made. How could this be happening? Maybe he really was dying. Maybe he and the captain never made it out of the Shenandoah Valley after all. Maybe this is what happens at death. The beautiful angel slaps you and then takes you home. It was all too much again. The same confusing surprise of close combat, of bushwhacking Missouri scum. Only this time the enemy wasn't from Missouri. This time the enemy was from Massachusetts, and smelled so pretty he didn't care what happened, just as long as she continued her advance. God, if she would just overrun him a little more. John, Gentry whispered as she leaned into him, her bosom pressing now ever so lightly his hard shoulder. I know what you need. And Gentry Grace, ever so gently, as one about to embrace a lion's head, slowly drew John's entire massive head into her own bare arms. At first, Gentry felt as if she had hugged a large tree. He did not yield, but she tugged him toward her. Come, I know what you need, John. John, gradually as he could, let his neck relax. His great head slowly descended onto her chest, just under her chin. You do not know what you are doing, Gentry Grace. Might as well embrace a bull and expect the horns, as to show tenderness to this beast. But there is something in this man that yearns the way I yearn. There is a longing in him, same as in me. I felt his whole unbreakable body in my small hand when I hit him. He will never be taken by violence. He must be crushed by tenderness. What is happening? The room is spinning, and the world smells of peppermint and some vague essence of peony, maybe hyacinth. If the general comes in now, it cannot go well. But this skin is like nothing before it, like nothing ever after. To die for this cause makes sense at last. Do you feel anything, John? Gentry Grace whispered into his blonde, tangled and matted mane. Gentry Grace repeated, do you feel anything? John Dane was clean enough. He had bathed for his appointment with the general. But Dane had done nothing to prepare for this engagement with the general's daughter, and what could John have done anyway? And who would have ever believed that such skin would ever allow itself contact with his? I suspect you feel me, John, Gentry said as she stroked the hair from his immense brow. I suspect that first you will feel me as a possible wife, a mate, a lover perhaps. Gentry Grace could literally feel John's pulse in his temple against her bare upper chest. His breath was shallow but hot, smelling vaguely of coffee and stale tobacco. Such breath was not offensive to Gentry. Such breathing was, however, difficult to mirror. Her own breath had seemed to have stopped. Gentry had become her stillness. The corporal cleared his throat and shifted his weight. He dared not lift his head from such a pillow. Let them sever it for where it lay. John didn't care anymore. This feeling, this touch had completely imprisoned him, while freeing a feeling he had never known before. His longing held him to her, though she feared it was her longing alone. His great hands lay plainly on the table. "Listen, John, listen. Do you hear that?" Gentry Grace whispered, still stroking his hair, still straightening the disheveled brain inside the pulsing head she held like a baby in her arms, beginning to cuddle him now, like a newborn. And it was some moments after this new contact that the good captain heard a wail let forth from the dining room, and then another wail and another, until such anguished sobs issued from the corporal that the agony heard would not have been distinguishable from another man pressed to his awful destruction from inside a medieval Iron Maiden. By noon, John Dane was sound asleep in the guest bedroom upstairs, where she and the captain had both conveyed him. He lay catty-cornered across the bed for his height, his giant boots on the floor. Gentry Grace had broken him with her compassion. He had been a fixed position of violence and hatred, a bastion, a fortress of rage and pain in front of her. So, Gentry Grace flanked his right side and found her way into his heart by taking and holding his tortured head to her breast. She had done what Quantrill's raiders could not do, what the Shenandoah Valley of Death failed to accomplish. Gentry Grace had captured Corporal John Dane, disarmed him with her bare arms, and lulled him into deep sleep by a single rebellious curl. Gentry Grace played painfully Chopin. It was not her hand that hurt her now. Her hand had stopped hurting 5 months ago. What hurt her now was the beauty of the preludes, soft on her fingertips. Those notes transmitted by touch of soft skin to smoothest ivory. How was any of this going to play out? Where was he now? What was the measure of her longing now? What had she done to the perfect soldier? She took his hatred and gave him her love in exchange. Would he hesitate in new compassion for his beloved enemy and be lost? For empathy in battle is a death sentence. Compassion in combat absurd. Maybe she had killed him with her kindness. And then a letter arrived. It was from Captain Cable Kent. Gentry Grace could not get her breath. O compassionate first line, Corporal Ding is well. Gentry Grace's heart quailed. She stifled a wail of gratitude, holding the post to her lips like a kerchief. Generous tears rolled down her face, falling onto the letter, spilling onto the back of her small hand. She was shaking, same as if he had died. His life, oh God, to be held in his hands, his mighty hands again, the way he had held her before he left. Her life had not ended from the first sentence, but had been commuted to another sentence following. John has regained himself. Do not panic. But he was shot in the head a fortnight ago. Oh God, please no, please, please no. The mini-ball failed to penetrate his skull. Though he is in great pain, he will recover, I believe, in full. I fear, however, that he shall require more care than he can receive in this field hospital near Chattanooga. Do you think you could take care for him? Oh, I think I can. I think I can care for him always. Oh, please spare him, my Lord. I will bring him myself, but as I will not leave him in any other care but your own, I must tell you this, Miss Gentry. Corporal Ding saved my life. We were both ambushed and receiving fire from all sides. Both of us were out of ammo within moments. There was no cover. Our horses lay squealing in the road as they had received the first volley. Corporal Dane stepped in front of me as he saw a rebel soldier level his Enfield at me. We were quickly reinforced, but not before John had taken the round meant for me. I tell you, I have not seen, not on 2 continents, such valor. My heart swells with admiration, gratitude, and love even now, so that it is difficult to write. As he fell backward onto me, I feared he was dead instantly. Only as I caught him and broke his fall to the ground, I heard only concern for my safety coming from him. The mini-ball caught him at the hairline and traveled under his scalp and out the back. In those first hours I was certain, and so was he, that he would not survive. He lost a lot of blood. The less powerful heart could not have borne the strain he has endured. But thanks be to God, he is stronger now, and seems himself again. P.S. In his darkest hour, when we both had accepted that this was his end, he pulled my head's ear to his mouth and repeated your name until he lost consciousness. He said your name like a prayer into the temple of my mind. Gentry Grace, Gentry Grace, Gentry Grace. I have never heard such a loving, impassioned prayer. No, not in this world, nor the next. Please, if you can, send orders for our immediate return by rail. His war is over now. Yours, Captain Cable Kent, September 1864, somewhere near Chattanooga. Gentry Grace felt like she was flying apart in all directions at once. He was alive. He could still die from infection. He was himself again. He had been shot in the head. How could anybody be themselves again after that? And who was he in the first place? She had held him for 10 minutes and loved him with her whole heart. She had kissed him where she had slapped him, and then the day after, he had caught her and kissed her full mouth in return, all the way to the soles of her feet. Her legs had failed her then. Had he not caught her, she would surely have gone to the ground. Only he did catch her, and he held her the way she had longed to be held, completely in his mighty hands, his powerful arms bearing her up. She had touched his face so gently then, like Chopin, and every prelude had poured from his wild blonde mane straight into her heart. Hours after he had rode away, she was still trembling from his touch. A week of euphoric bliss to follow, and then the general had a second stroke. And all that sustained her through her father's own pain was the love of a soldier she had saved from hell at her mother's dining room table 5 months before. Oh, John must be in terrible pain. But the captain seemed to think the worst was over. Oh, happy day to hear of him. She knew John could not read or write very well, so letters were not forthcoming. The kindness of his captain, however, had sustained Gentry Grace over the last 5 months, had kept Gentry Grace strong, even as her father had daily weakened. Of course, the orders would go out within the quarter hour. Her father had been quiet the whole morning. Perhaps she might wait to wake him, to clear the orders before she drew them up. The letter was wet with her tears as she ascended the stair. Father would be happy his soldier sons At least 2 more of them would be returning, of his several thousand others who never would. Gentry Grace received a second letter that day. It lay across the chest of her beloved General Father. The moment she touched his bedroom door, she knew he was gone. The reverence for a life just ended filled the room. Gentry, as was custom, opened the window despite the cold winter wind. It was a gesture to the soul now leaving. Gentry Grace kissed her father's forehead and closed his eyes with her fingertips, lightly touching the lifeless lids, like piano keys. She played, her father's green eyes closed, like the end of a sonata. Oh, my father, no daughter has loved her daddy any more than I have loved you. It has been my honor. May flights of angels sing thee to thy rest. Gentry picked up the packet on his chest. She assumed some last will, some last directive. Instead, there were only 3 empty pages, with his signature at the bottom of each page. Always before, the pages had been full of his orders. Always before, she had only been his voice. He had given her leave to vent her anger on that soldier in his name, but there was never any question who really gave the orders. That is, not until today. And always before, as was standard operating procedure, he never signed anything until he had read and reread what he had written. Now, in his death, she was free to fill in whatever orders she would. 3 signatures, like 3 wishes he had granted his beloved Gentry Grace. It was then Gentry Grace realized the wideness of the world. With 1 signature, she wrote orders to bring her beloved home. What would she do with the other 2? Only what she could. And while Gentry Grace could not stop the war with 100 of her father's signatures, she could order leave for 4,000 of her brothers. Not all at once, of course, but by the spring her roses would be in bloom, and her soldiers, that big one especially, would be home from an awful war to help her tend them. Because she would need help tending such a large crop. For Gentry Grace had planted a flower for every one of her brigaded brothers over the last 4 years. What a sight it will be, she mused. 4,000 red roses blooming in the spring of our new content. My brother's home, the love of my life home, too. I shall hold my giant soldier, my longing in these 2 small hands, and I shall love him like the grateful rain. Oh, my Father, be at peace in heaven. Rest now, for I am at peace on earth at last.